Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel Close Reading with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm looking at Percy Bysshe Shelley's A Defence of Poetry. I'm going to introduce the idea of sympathy in the long 18th century in order to consider Percy Bysshe Shelley's invocation of the active imagination as agent for moral good. Essentially, I'm going to outline what Shelley's defence of poetry actually is. If you like my channel, do please subscribe so that you see my new weekly videos when they're posted, and do hit the thumbs up. It really helps me in YouTube's algorithm. This is the monument to Percy Bysshe Shelley, and you can see his wife, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, sort of cradling him tenderly here. And I just want to start today by thinking of some definitions of sympathy. The root of the word sympathy lie in the Greek sympathia, which means feeling with or having a fellow feeling. So you can see connotations of the words with and fellow. We've got this idea of companionable, an idea of sharing. And this sense of fellow feeling and companionability and sharing, a sort of a sense of mutuality, is clear from Samuel Johnson's mid-18th century Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1755. Johnson defined sympathy as fellow feeling, again, this idea of fellows. Mutual sensibility, the quality of being affected by the affection of another. So Johnson really highlights the emotions of sympathy. We've got the idea of sensibility. We've got the idea of being affected by affection. Alongside his definitions, Johnson also included quotations to illustrate the uses of a particular word. That is, to contextualize a word's usage. And for sympathy, one of the contextualizing extracts that Johnson used was from Robert South's sermons. These are of the late 17th century. In particular, one entitled A Sermon Preached at Christ Church, Oxon, so that's Oxford, before the university, October 17th, 1675, and it reads, "There never was any heart truly great and generous that was not also tender and compassionate. It is this noble quality that makes all men to be of one kind." So you can see here there's the idea of universality, that all humans are one kind, and that sympathy is the heart's most noble quality. For every man would be a distinct species to himself were there no sympathy among individuals. So there's a sort of rejection of individualism. We can see that sympathy here is perceived as a moral tool for the benefit of society, for the benefit of the whole species. Sympathy discourages every man from being a distinct species unto himself. Sympathy, therefore, is a tool that discourages individualism. Worries about the rise of the individual, as it's called, or individualism, were in the 17th and 18th centuries going hand in hand with worries about the rise of capitalism, about the changing of the social system, the breaking down of the community-based feudal system of social organization to the development of a capitalist model of social organization, which involves each individual person becoming their own economic unit. So during this period, there was a worry about the diminishment, the decline of sympathy as a social good. And Robert South's late 17th century notion of sympathy being a moral imperative is continued into the moral philosophy of the mid-18th century, especially among the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers such as David Hume and Adam Smith. In David Hume's 1739 publication, A Treatise of Human Nature into Moral Subjects, for example, he claims that sympathy is a powerful principle in human nature. Indeed, that sympathy is the chief source of moral distinctions. The chief source. So sympathy is absolutely fundamental to our morality. Hume argues in the treatise that the sentiments of moral approval and disapproval are caused by the operations of sympathy. So what we cannot sympathise with, we think of with moral disapproval, and what we do sympathise with, we think of with moral approval. 20 years later, David Hume's fellow Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and this is Adam Smith, published his Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759. Sympathy, again, was the term that Smith used in describing these moral sentiments. For Smith, sympathy is an imaginative experience. The observer imaginatively reconstructs the experience of the person that she or he is observing. As we have no immediate experience of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in the like situation. Though our brother is on the rack, as long as we ourselves are at our ease, our senses will never inform us of what he suffers. They never did and never can carry us beyond our own person. And it is by imagination only that we can form any conception of what are his sensations. Neither can the faculty help us to this any other way than by representing to us what would be our own if we were in his case. It is the impressions of our own senses only, not those of his, which our imaginations copy. By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. And so for Smith, imagination is the basis of our moral sentiments because it represents to us what would be our own sensations if we were in another person's case. And this is the essence of sympathy. This notion of sympathy as the highest moral faculty and as an imaginative act extends into the philosophy of Romantic period writers at the beginning of the next century, the 19th century. In particular, I'm going to look at Percy Bysshe Shelley's A Defence of Poetry, which was composed between February and March 1821, although it remained unpublished until after his death, and it was eventually published in 1840, and it was edited by his wife, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who you may have heard of as the author of Frankenstein. In A Defence of Poetry, Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote that the imagination is enlarged by a sympathy with pains and passions so mighty that they distend in their conception the capacity of that by which they are conceived. So by that which they are conceived is the imagination. So for Shelley, sympathy actually makes the imagination more imaginative. The more one has sympathy with pains and passions, the more one imagines them, the greater the capacity one has to imagine further pains and passions. It is considering with sympathy those pains and passions that distend in their conception. So as you are thinking about pains and passions, they distend, they extend the capacity of that by which they are conceived. So they extend the capacity of the imagination. Echoing the notion of sympathy outlined by David Hume, that sympathy is the chief source of moral distinctions, Shelley also conceives of sympathy as a moral good. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. One should not just be in sympathy with other real people and their actions then, but one must also imagine outside of our own nature in thought. And furthermore, that love, that sympathy enables us to have an identification of ourselves in something that is not our own. It enables us to identify with the other. Shelley continues, a man to be greatly good must, and that must shows that it's a moral imperative. He must imagine intensely and comprehensively, so it's not passive but active. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. So it's this idea that we have a moral imperative to multiply our sympathy. The pleasures and pains of his species must become his own. So we've got a real sense of the universal over the individual, of the whole species. It is your responsibility to be sympathetic towards. You must, with that moral imperative, you must exercise your sympathy towards others. That is a moral imperative. You cannot get out of it. You must do it. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination. So it's very clearly laid out by Shelley. It's the great instrument of moral good, the imagination. So the imagination isn't a kind of airy, fairy, disembodied, passive thing that some people have and other people don't. But the imagination is the active principle of moral good. So, in essence, you are being morally bad if you do not exercise your capacity for imagination and extend your capacity for sympathy. And now we come to poetry. So poetry strengthens the faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. So poetry, or I would suggest literature in general, strengthens the imagination and thus the moral nature of humanity in the same way as exercise strengthens the body. The imagination then is not a kind of fixed quality that some people have and others don't. One's engagement with our imaginations must not be passive. Instead, we must actively exercise our imaginations. The use of the imagination is that it is a skill that needs to be developed and practiced. We should not just kind of passively hang around waiting for imagination and sympathy to strike us. Instead, we must actively engage our imaginations, exercise our imaginations in order to sympathize with others, in order to exercise actively our morality. If sympathy extends our imaginations, then exercising our imaginations extends the capacity of our morality. And so poetry, or literature in general, is how we exercise, how we strengthen our imaginations, and thus how we strengthen our morality. You can't expect to have a healthy body if you don't exercise it. Similarly, you cannot expect to have a healthy sense of moral good if you don't exercise it, and you exercise it through imagination. For Shelley, the imaginative faculty of sympathy is required to be greatly good, and this putting of yourself into the place of another and of many others must be done intensely and comprehensively. The great instrument of moral good is sympathy. Sympathy strengthens the moral nature of man in the same way that exercise strengthens our bodies. For Shelley, imaginative sympathy is our collective moral imperative. Poetry, or literature more generally, is how we strengthen our imaginations, how we strengthen our moral capacity, how we strengthen our ability to see outside of our individual selves. And this is why everybody, should read literature. And this is Shelley's defense of poetry. And frankly, I can't really think of a better defense. Like my channel, do please subscribe so you'll see my new weekly videos when they're uploaded. Do hit the thumbs up and answer me this. Do you agree with Shelley? Let me know in the comments below.